The stagecoach left her at the edge of Cedar Bend, with a trunk that held everything she owned, and a letter folded so many times the creases had begun to fray through. Theda Marsh stood in the road and watched the dust settle around her boots, and for a long moment she could not make herself walk toward the town. The letter in her hand was 3 months old. The man who had written it had paid for her passage from St. Louis and promised a small house, a kind welcome, and a wedding by the first frost. She had received word 2 weeks into her journey that he had died of a fever in a logging camp she had never heard of. She had kept traveling. Anyway, there was nothing behind her to go back to. The wind smelled of horses and wood smoke and the bitter green of sage. A man on the boardwalk outside the mercantile looked her over once, then turned away as if she had already been judged and dismissed. Theda lifted her trunk by its leather handle and started walking. Her arms burned before she had gone 20 paces, but she did not set it down. A woman who set her trunk down in a strange town invited people to decide what to do with it for her. She found the boarding house at the end of the main street, a clapboard building with a sagging porch and a sign that said, "Rooms" in letters faded to the color of old paper. The woman who answered the door had a mouth like a drawstring purse, and eyes that took in Theda's traveling dress, her dust-streaked face, and the trunk at her feet in one practiced sweep. "I have no rooms," the woman said before Theda had spoken. "I have money, 2 weeks paid in advance. I have no rooms for women traveling alone." Theda kept her face very still. She had learned, somewhere between her mother's deathbed and the wagon that had carried her west, that the worst thing a woman could do when she was being refused was to argue. Arguing gave the refusing party something to refuse. She picked up her trunk again. "Is there anywhere in this town a person can sleep that is not the road?" The woman's mouth tightened further. "There is the Callaway place. They sometimes take help. The youngest boy was thrown last spring, and Holt has been short-handed since. You might ask there. It is 2 miles east of town. Follow the wagon road past the schoolhouse." She closed the door before Theda could thank her. Theda stood on the porch with her trunk and considered the angle of the sun. It was past 3 in the afternoon. 2 miles east, in this heat, with this weight. She set her jaw and started walking. She left the trunk behind a rain barrel at the edge of the schoolhouse yard, covered with her shawl. If someone stole it, they stole it. She could not carry it 2 miles. She walked with her hands free and her bonnet pulled forward against the sun, and the road went on longer than 2 miles, or her body had simply forgotten how to measure distance. The land opened out into long pale grass and low hills, and somewhere ahead of her she could hear the lowing of cattle and the bark of a dog that meant work was being done. The Callaway ranch announced itself, with a long pole gate and a brand burned into the crossbar. A half-moon over a letter C. Theda walked through the gate and down a track lined with cottonwoods, and as she came around the bend, she saw the house. It was bigger than she had expected. 2 stories, a deep porch, a kitchen wing reaching out toward a vegetable garden, gone to seed, a barn beyond, a corral where 3 horses stood in the late light, switching their tails at flies. A man was leaning on the corral fence with his back to her, and even from a distance, she could see how still he was, not relaxed, watching something the way a man watches a thing that he cannot fix. She came up behind him slowly so as not to startle him. He turned before she spoke. He was tall, that was the first thing. Tall and lean in the way of men who worked from sunup to sundown and ate what they had time to eat. His hair was dark and cut close at the temples. His eyes were the gray of weather, coming in off the plains, and they took her in without hurry and without judgment, only assessment. He wore a faded blue shirt and a dark vest, and the gun on his hip looked as if it had been part of him for so long he no longer thought about it. "You are lost," he said. His voice was lower than she had braced for. "I am looking for Holt Callaway. You found him. She held out the letter. He did not take it. He looked at her hand, at the paper folded in it, and then back at her face. Mrs. Trumbull at the boarding house sent me. She said you were short-handed, since your boy was thrown. A muscle moved in his jaw. He looked past her shoulder out at the road and then down at his boots. When he looked back at her, his face had closed entirely. Mrs. Trumbull talks too much. I can cook. I can sew. I can read and write. I am not afraid of work. I do not need a cook. Then I will leave. She turned to go. She had walked perhaps 3 steps when his voice came again, quieter. Where would you go? She stopped. She did not turn around. The wind moved across the grass, and she could feel sweat drying cold along her spine. I do not know. There was a long silence behind her. She could hear one of the horses in the corral blow softly through its nose. She could hear her own heart. There is a room off the kitchen, he said. It was the housekeeper's before she left. You can have it until you find better. I will not pay you wages until I know what you are worth. You will eat what we eat. You will not be bothered. She turned around. He was still standing at the fence and he had not moved closer, and the distance between them felt like a kindness he was offering deliberately. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. There is a boy in this house. He is 9. His name is Webb. He was thrown by a horse 5 months ago and has not been on one since. He does not speak about it. You will not speak about it either. I understand, and if you cannot keep that promise, you will leave the next morning. I understand. He looked at her for another moment, and then he turned back to the corral, and she understood that she had been dismissed in a way that was not unkind, only finished. She walked back up the track toward the house, and as she went, she realized her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the strange, terrible relief of being given a door to walk through the room. Off the kitchen was small and clean. A narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out toward the kitchen garden. There was a hook on the back of the door for a coat and a wooden peg above the washstand for a mirror that was no longer there. Theda set down her bonnet and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against the quilt to stop them trembling, and that was how the boy found her. He stood in the doorway with one shoulder against the frame and looked at her with the careful blankness of a child who had decided long ago that strangers were not safe to be curious about. He was small for 9. Dark hair like his father's, a scab on his elbow and his shirt buttoned wrong. You are the new woman, he said. I am Theda. Pa said you might not stay. That is true, I might not. He considered her. What can you cook? Cornbread stew. Biscuits, pie, if there is fruit. There is no fruit, then no pie. His mouth moved at the corner, not quite a smile, but close enough that she could see what his real smile might look like. He pushed off the doorframe and disappeared down the hall without another word, and she sat there for another long minute before she stood up and went to find the kitchen. She made cornbread and a stew of beans and salt pork and the last of the carrots from the cellar. And at sundown she set 3 plates on the long table in the dining room because she did not know how the household ate. Holt came in from the corral with his hat in his hand and stood in the doorway, looking at the table. You can set 2, he said. The boy eats with me. She moved the 3rd plate. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and washed his hands at the basin in the corner, and Webb came down the stairs and slid into his chair without looking at her, and they ate in silence. Holt cleaned his plate. Webb pushed his food around and ate enough to satisfy his father, and then sat with his hands in his lap. Theda kept her eyes on her own plate and did not try to make conversation. She had learned that too. When Holt finished, he set his fork down and looked at her across the table. It is good, he said. And then, because he was a man who did not waste words, he stood up and went out to finish whatever work the day still owed him. Webb looked at her then for the first time since they had sat down. He has not said that about a meal since Ma died. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and after a moment, he climbed down from his chair and followed his father out into the dusk. The first week, she learned the shape of the house and the shape of the men in it. Holt rose before dawn and was in the barn by the time she had the coffee on. He came in for breakfast and left without speaking. He came in for the noon meal and ate standing sometimes when the work was bad. He came in at dusk and washed and ate and sat for an hour on the porch with a tin cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, looking out at the road. He slept in the room at the end of the hall. She heard him sometimes in the middle of the night, walking. Not pacing, just walking the length of the upper floor as if he had forgotten where he was going, and could not stop until he remembered. Webb did his chores in the henhouse and the kitchen garden, and would not go near the barn. She noticed this on the second day. He carried water from the well past the corral with his eyes fixed on the ground. He went around the back of the barn, rather than through it. When his father called him to ride out to check the south fence, the boy went pale and said nothing, and Holt looked at him for a long moment, and then said, "Stay and help the woman," and rode out alone. She did not speak about it. She had been told not to, but she watched, and she saw the way the boy looked at the horses when he thought no one was watching him, not with fear, with grief. The way a man looks at a woman he has loved and lost and cannot speak to any more. On the fifth day, she was kneading bread on the kitchen table when she heard a sound from the yard that did not belong. A high, thin note, almost a scream. She wiped her hands on her apron and went out, and Webb was standing at the gate of the corral with his hands gripping the top rail so hard his knuckles had gone white. Inside the corral, one of the horses, a sorrel mare with a white blaze, was down on her side, kicking at her own belly. "Pa is in town," Webb said without turning. He took the buckboard for the seed order. "He will not be back until after dark." Theda climbed the gate before she had decided to. She did not know horses the way her grandmother had known them, but she had watched her grandmother work, and she had paid attention. She knelt by the mare's head and put her palm flat against the wet, hot side of the animal's neck, and felt the panic running through her like a current. "Colic," she said. "How long has she been like this? I do not know." I came out, and she was down. "Bring me a bucket of warm water from the kitchen. Bring me the jar of dried mint from the shelf above the stove, and bring me a length of rope." He ran. He did not ask why. He came back with all three, breathing hard, and she crushed the mint into the water and worked the mare's head up and got her to swallow what she could, and then she got the rope on her and made her stand. The mare did not want to stand. Theda made her. She walked her in slow, tight circles around the corral, talking to her in a low, steady voice. And Webb watched from the gate with his face stricken and luminous. And when the mare finally passed gas and her sides stopped heaving, he made a small sound in his throat that might have been a sob if he had let it. Theda walked the mare for another half-hour to be sure. When she finally led her back to the water trough and let her drink small, careful sips, she looked up, and Webb was inside the corral. He had not climbed the fence. She had not seen him do it. But he was standing 6 feet from the mare with his hands at his sides, and his face was wet. "You can come closer," Theda said quietly. "She is all right now." He shook his head. "You do not have to. I only meant you could." He stood there for another moment, and then he walked, very slowly, the way a person walks toward a thing they have been dreaming about, and he put his hand on the mare's shoulder. And the mare turned her head and breathed warm against his hair, and Webb closed his eyes. That was how Holt found them when he rode in at twilight with the buckboard. He did not say anything. He came down out of the wagon seat and walked to the corral and looked at the mare, and then at his son, standing with his hand on the mare's shoulder, and then at Theda, who had stepped back to the gate. His face did not change, but his hands, which had been resting on the top rail, gripped the wood and stayed there as if he needed something to hold. That night, after the boy was in bed, Holt found her in the kitchen, washing the last of the supper plates. He stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hand, and watched her for a long moment, before he spoke. He has not touched a horse since his mother's brother put him on the gelding that threw him. The doctor said his arm would never set right, and it did. The boy did not. She kept her hands in the water. She did not turn around. You did not push him. No! Why? She thought about it. She wrung out the cloth and set it on the edge of the basin. Because being pushed is what hurt him, and because I did not know if he could be pushed back into something good or only into something worse. So I left him to find his own way. He was silent so long, she finally turned. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read, not gratitude. Something underneath it. Mrs. Trumbull will be sorry she sent you here, he said. She likes to be the one who knows things first. It was so close to a joke that she almost laughed. He saw her almost laugh, and the corner of his own mouth moved, and then he set his hat back on and went out to the porch. And she heard him out there for a long time after, not moving, just sitting in the dark. The next morning, Webb was in the kitchen before she had the fire going. He stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, with his hair sticking up and his bare feet on the cold boards. "Will you teach me what you did with the mint?" he asked. "Yes, and the other things you know about horses. I do not know very much. You know more than I do." So she began to teach him what little she knew, how to read a horse's eye, how to tell a cough that meant dust from a cough that meant sickness, how to soak a hoof in a bucket of warm water and Epsom salts when it was tender. He followed her around the yard with the gravity of a small priest, and within a week he was going into the barn on his own to bring her things. He still would not get on a horse, but he would stand near them. He would put his hand on them. He would talk to the mare, who he had decided was his, in a voice his father had not heard him use in nearly half a year. Holt watched all of it without speaking. But she noticed that when he came in for the noon meal, now he sat down at the table instead of eating standing. And she noticed that he had begun to leave the door of his study open in the evening, when he did his ledgers, as if he wanted to hear what was happening in the rest of the house. 2 weeks after she had come, he built her a shelf. She came into her room one evening to find it on the wall above the washstand, a plain pine board sanded smooth and pegged into the studs, just wide enough for the small things a woman might want to set down where she could see them. Her hairbrush, the tortoiseshell comb that had been her mother's, the small blue glass bottle she kept for no reason, except that it had been the only pretty thing in her trunk. She stood in front of the shelf for a long time. He had not mentioned it at supper. He had not asked her if she wanted it. He had simply seen that the room had no place to put a thing, and he had made one. She did not thank him directly. She set out a clean shirt of his that she had mended without being asked and left it folded on the table by the door of his study, and the next morning she found a small bundle of late wild sage on the kitchen windowsill, picked from somewhere out beyond the south fence. They did not speak of any of it. They did not need to. The trouble came on a Tuesday. She had walked into town with Webb to buy flour and a spool of black thread, and she had felt the way the women on the boardwalk looked at her before she had passed 3 storefronts. She had felt it the first time she had come to town with Holt for the Sunday service, and she had felt it again the second time, and now she felt it, with a sharpness that meant something had shifted. Mrs. Trumbull was standing outside the mercantile with 2 other women in dark bonnets, and as Theda approached, the conversation died, and 3 sets of eyes turned on her with the flat hostility of women who had decided a thing among themselves and now intended to deliver it. "Mrs. Marsh," Mrs. Trumbull said a word. "I am Miss Marsh." "Yes, that is the matter we wish to discuss." Theda kept her hand on Webb's shoulder. The boy had gone very still beside her. "You have been living in the Callaway house for 5 weeks now," Mrs. Trumbull said. 5 weeks, with a widowed man, with no chaperone, with no understanding. I am his housekeeper. You are not his housekeeper. You are not paid as one. You eat at his table, you walk to town with his son. The whole valley knows. The whole valley is welcome to ask Mr. Callaway about the arrangement. The whole valley does not need to ask. The whole valley can see. One of the other women, a thin, sharp-faced woman, whose name Theda did not know, leaned forward. There is talk that you came here on a promise of marriage to another man, that you arrived already, a widow, without ever having been a wife. That a woman who can change her circumstance so quickly is a woman whose circumstance was not what she said it was. Theda felt the heat rise in her face. She did not let it move her mouth. My circumstance was exactly what I said it was. The man I was meant to marry died. I had nothing to go back to. I have not lied about any of it. And yet you are still here. And yet I am still here. Mrs. Trumbull's mouth drew tight. There is a meeting at the church tomorrow evening. The Reverend has asked Mr. Callaway to attend. There are questions to be answered. We thought you should know. Theda did not answer. She walked past them with Webb's hand in hers, and she bought her flour and her thread, and she walked the 2 miles back to the ranch, with her shoulders square and her face composed. And when she came through the kitchen door, she set down the parcel and put her hands flat on the table and stood there for a long moment until she trusted herself to move again. Webb watched her from the doorway. They were mean to you. They were worried about something they did not understand. You were not mean back? No. Why not? She looked at him. He was 9 years old, and his shirt was buttoned wrong again, and he had a smudge of dust across his cheekbone, and he was looking at her the way a child looks at a person he has decided to learn from. Because mean is what they were expecting, she said. And I did not want to give them what they were expecting. Holt came in at sundown, and she told him about the meeting. She told him plainly and without softening it, because he was a man who would not thank her for softening it. He listened with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the floor. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long time. I will go tomorrow. He said they will ask you to send me away. I know. What will you tell them? He looked up at her. The gray of his eyes had darkened with something she had not seen in them before. I have not decided. He went out to the porch and sat there with his coffee. She did not follow him. She washed the dishes and put Webb to bed and lay in her own narrow bed in the room off the kitchen and listened to the wind in the cottonwoods and thought about packing her trunk in the morning so that she would be ready if the answer was the one she expected. But she did not pack. She lay in the dark, and she let the fear go through her like weather. And when it had passed, she got up and lit her candle and sat at the small table by the window and wrote a letter. She did not write it to him. She wrote it to Webb. She told him that she had loved coming to know him. She told him that he was braver than he believed, and that the mare was his and would be his, whether she was there or not. She folded the letter and put it inside the cover of the small book of her mother's that she kept on her new shelf. If she was gone in 2 days, he would find it when he looked for her. The next evening, Holt put on a clean shirt and brushed down his hat and saddled his horse. And Theda watched him from the kitchen window as he rode out, and she felt something in her chest go very quiet. She fed Webb his supper. She read to him from the small book on her shelf, the parts that were not the letter. She put him to bed, and then she sat in the kitchen by the lamp, and she waited. He came back after midnight. She heard his horse on the track before she heard the door. She heard him in the barn, taking his time with the gear the way a tired man does when he does not want to come inside yet. When he finally came through the kitchen door, his hat was in his hand, and his face was so closed she could not tell what had happened. "Sit down," she said. "There is coffee." He sat. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him and sat across from him, with her hands folded in her lap. He drank half the cup before he spoke. "They wanted me to put you out tonight. Send you back to town with a man from the church to stay at the parsonage until a stage could take you east." She nodded. She had expected as much. "The Reverend said it was for your protection. For the protection of the boy. For my reputation." "And what did you tell them?" He set down the cup. He looked at his hands on the table. His hands were big and scarred across the knuckles, and there was a streak of dust along one wrist that he had missed when he had washed. He looked at his hands as if he had never seen them before. I told them that my wife died 4 years ago, in a room upstairs in this house, and that I have not slept a full night since. I told them that my son has not been on a horse since his uncle put him on a gelding the boy was not ready for, and that the only person who has been able to bring him near a horse again is you. I told them that you came into this house when I did not know what to do, and you have not asked me for anything. Not a wage, not a promise, not a kindness, I did not freely give. And I told them that I would not put you out of my house for the sake of their comfort, because their comfort had not been the thing keeping me alive. These last 5 weeks, she could not speak. She sat very still and let him keep talking, because she understood that he had been carrying these words for longer than she had been there, and that they had to be said now, or they would never be said at all. The Reverend said that if I would not put you out, I should marry you, to make it right in the eyes of the town. And what did you say to that? He looked at her then. His gray eyes were steady. I said that I would not marry a woman to satisfy a town. I said that if I married you, it would be because I wanted to, and because she wanted to, and that the town could come or stay home as it pleased. The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp hissed. Somewhere a coyote called from the ridge, and another one answered. Theta, he said. He had not used her name before. It came out of his mouth like something he had been keeping in his pocket. I am not asking you tonight. I am only telling you what I said. I will not ask you anything in this room at this hour when you are tired and frightened. But I wanted you to know what I said, so that you could decide what to do with knowing it. She found that she could speak after all. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. What did Mrs. Trumbull say? Mrs. Trumbull said a great deal. None of it mattered, and the rest of them. Some of them will come around. Some will not. The ones who will not were never going to. She nodded. She looked down at her own hands in her lap. I have to tell you something, she said. All right, I wrote a letter last night to Webb, in case I was sent away in the morning. I wanted him to know I had not just left him. He was quiet. When she looked up, his face had changed. There was something raw in it now, something he had not let her see before. I did not know how to write one to you. He stood up slowly. He walked around the table and stopped beside her chair. He did not sit. He stood there with his hand resting on the back of her chair, not touching her, only close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder, and she understood that he was asking her permission for something, without using words. She turned in the chair and put her hand over his on the wood. He did not kiss her. He did not pull her up. He only turned his hand under hers so that their palms met, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they stayed like that for what might have been a full minute, neither of them breathing very deeply, and she thought she had never in her life felt anything as loud as the quiet between them. Go to bed, he said finally. We will talk in the morning. She went. She lay in the dark, and she did not sleep, but she did not need to. In the morning, he was in the kitchen before her, which had never happened. He had built up the fire and put the coffee on, and he was sitting at the table with his hands wrapped around a tin cup, and he looked up when she came in. I have been thinking, he said. So have I. Sit down. I am not a young man. I have a son who is not over what happened to him. I have a ranch that takes everything I have. I am quiet, and I am hard to live with, and I have not been a husband to anyone in 4 years, and I do not know if I remember how. All right, but I would learn. If you would have me, I would learn it. She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the window behind him and catching the dust in the air, and his face in that light was younger than it had been the day before, and softer, and she could see for the first time the man he might have been before. Grief had set his jaw the way it had. I will have you, she said. He let out a breath he had been holding for a long time. He nodded once. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and they sat there, with their coffee going cold between them. And Webb came down the stairs in his nightshirt, and stopped in the doorway and looked at their joined hands without surprise. "Are you getting married?" he said. "Yes," Holt said. "Good." He went to the bread box for a heel of bread and went back upstairs to get dressed, and Theda put her face in her free hand and laughed, and Holt's hand tightened on hers. The wedding was on a Saturday 3 weeks later, in the front room of the ranch house, because Holt would not be married in a church whose congregation had voted on his private life. The Reverend came anyway, which Theda took as a kind of apology, and Mrs. Trumbull did not come, which Theda took as a different kind. Half the town came, the other half stayed home. The half that came brought pies and a cured ham and a bolt of pale yellow cloth that the women had pooled their money for, and Theda accepted all of it with the grace of a woman who had decided that holding a grudge was a luxury she did not have time for. Webb stood beside his father in a clean shirt and a tie that he had let Theda fix at the throat. When the Reverend asked Holt to take her hand, Holt did so without looking at the Reverend at all. He looked at her. His gray eyes held hers, and did not leave them through the whole of the vow, and when he said the words, he said them quietly, as if they were meant only for her, and the rest of the room was being permitted to overhear. After the supper, after the guests had gone, and the dishes had been carried in and the lamps lit, Webb came to her in the kitchen with something in his hands. It was a length of old leather, soft with use, that he had cut and worked into a hatband. "He held it out for your bonnet," he said. "Pa helped me. I did most of it." She took it. She knelt down and put her arms around him, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he hugged her back, and she felt his small, thin arms tight around her neck, and she understood then that the wedding had been for him as much as for her, and that he had known it. "Webb," she said into his hair, "I want to ask you something. You do not have to answer now. You do not have to answer ever." "All right. The mare. Have you thought any more about riding her?" He was quiet. She could feel him thinking against her shoulder. "I do not know," he said. "I think about it, but I do not know. You do not have to. Not for me. Not for your pa. Not for anyone." He pulled back and looked at her. "You have never told me I had to." "No. Pa has never told me I had to, either, not since you came." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Your pa loves you very much." "I know." He went off to bed then, and she stood in the kitchen with the leather hatband in her hand, and Holt came in from the porch and stopped behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him, and that was the first time in either of their lives that they had stood that way. And it felt like a door opening that had been closed for so long. Neither of them had remembered the room behind it. He did get on the mare. Not that week and not the next, but on a clear morning in late autumn, when the cottonwoods had gone gold and the air had the first edge of cold in it. Theda was in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the turnips, when she heard hooves in the yard and looked up and saw Holt leading the mare, with Webb on her back. Webb was holding the reins loosely, the way she had shown him. His face was pale, and his back was very straight, and Holt was walking beside him with one hand on the mare's bridle and the other resting lightly on the boy's knee. And they came across the yard at a slow, steady walk, and Webb saw her and lifted his free hand off the reins and waved. She lifted her own muddy hand and waved back, and she did not cry, because she had decided long ago that she was not the kind of woman who cried at things, but she pressed her wrist against her mouth and stood very still until they had gone past. And Holt looked at her over Webb's head, and his face was open in a way that no one in Cedar Bend would have recognized as the face of Holt Callaway, and she thought she might be the only person on earth who would ever see it that way, and she thought that was enough, and more than enough. And the only thing in this life she had ever asked for, and not known she was asking for. The winter came. They got through it. Webb rode every clear day. Theda taught him his letters in the long evenings by the kitchen stove, and Holt sat across the room, with his ledgers open on his knee, and watched them, more than he watched his numbers, and once or twice a week, he would set the ledgers down and come and stand behind her chair and put his hand on the back of her neck. And she would lean her head against his arm, and they would stay like that for a while, and then he would go back to his work, and she would go back to hers, and the lamp would burn down, and the night would settle over the ranch, and the mare in the barn would shift in her stall, and the world, for the small space of the house, would be quiet. In the spring, the prairie came back green. The cottonwoods budded out, and the creek ran high, and the calves dropped in the south pasture, and Theda planted her garden with the careful pleasure of a woman planting in ground she intended to stand on for the rest of her life. Holt put a porch swing on the east side of the house, because she had said once, in passing, that her grandmother had had one. She found it there one morning and stood in front of it with her hand over her mouth, and he came up behind her and said, "I should have done it sooner," and she shook her head, because some things were better for having been waited for. They sat on it that evening, after supper, the two of them, with Webb up at the corral, talking to the mare in the low murmur of a boy who had learned that animals listened. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and the sky over the prairie had gone the color of the inside of a peach, and Holt had his arm along the back of the swing, and her shoulder fit against his side, as if it had been built for the purpose. Somewhere a meadowlark called, somewhere a horse blew through its nose. The wind moved across the grass, and carried with it the smell of sage and wood smoke and the new green of growing things. "I did not think I would have this again," he said quietly. "I had stopped looking. You did not look. I walked up the road. You walked up the road, and you did not turn me away. I almost did. I know." His hand came up and rested on her hair very lightly, the way a man touches something he is still half afraid will not be there in the morning. "Theda," he said. "Yes, I am glad I did not." She closed her eyes. She listened to the meadowlark and the wind and the small distant murmur of the boy at the corral, and she felt her husband's hand in her hair and the warmth of him against her side, and she thought that there had been a long stretch of her life when she had walked through the world expecting to be told to move along, and that she would never again walk through the world that way, and that the difference was not that she had been rescued, because she had not been rescued, but that she had walked up a road, and a man had not turned her away, and a boy had not pushed her away, and a horse had not refused her, and that was the whole of it. The light went out of the sky slowly. Webb came down from the corral and sat on the porch, step at their feet, and leaned his back against her knees, and she put her hand on his head, and Holt's arm tightened around her shoulders. And none of them said anything for a long while, because there was nothing left that needed saying. In a town 2 miles west, in a house with a sagging porch, Mrs. Trumbull was probably saying something to someone. It did not matter. The prairie did not care. The mare in the barn did not care. The meadowlark did not care. The 3 people on the porch swing did not care either, and that was the newest and best thing of all. And Theda Callaway, who had stepped off a stagecoach 6 months before, with a folded letter and a trunk and no place to go, sat in the dusk on a porch that had been built for her.